Muy bien, pues a continuación va a intervenir el profesor Laurent Olivier. Como no vais a encontrar en el programa su currículum, voy a leer unas líneas sobre su perfil, ¿no? Laurent Olivier es conservador jefe del Departamento de Arqueología celta y galorromana del Museo Arqueológico Nacional de Saint-Germain, y sus trabajos están relacionados con tres áreas principales. Por un lado, con la Edad del Hierro, con un importante proyecto interdisciplinar sobre la explotación de la sal en la Lorena. Por otro lado, con la teoría arqueológica, destacando su libro El oscuro abismo del tiempo, memoria y arqueología, traducción mía, que ha sido ya traducido al inglés y que pronto estará disponible también en castellano. Y, en tercer lugar, se ha dedicado a hacer estudios sobre historia de la arqueología, ámbito en el que ha profundizado en la historia de la arqueología francesa, su papel en la construcción de identidades nacionales y la implicación de los arqueólogos franceses y alemanes con el nazismo, con bastante rigor y valentía, ¿no?
Thank you. First I have to, yes, thank you. Where can... First, I have to thank the organizers of this major conference, Gonzalo Ruiz Zapatero, and who is the president of the Spanish Society for the History of Archaeology, and also the director of the Spanish-Man, Andres Carretero Perez, for their very kind invitation to talk this morning. And I have also to apologize since I'm not able to speak in Spanish, so I'm going to do it in English, but I think you would understand. So our two museums, the Spanish Man and the French Man, are celebrating this year their 150 years of creation. And since the end of the 18th century, in fact, the French Man and Spanish archaeology have been tied with strong links. It begins with Deschlet, for instance, Joseph Deschlet, who was a great archaeologist of the Iron Age, and he worked on the chronology of the Spanish Bronze and Iron Ages. He was a close friend to the Abbé Breuil, who worked on the Altamira cave, and he was also surveying the rock art in Spain, which is, as you know, very, very important. But above all, it was Raymond Lantier, who was a curator in the 30s up to the 50s, who developed strong links, strong academical and institutional links between French and Spanish archaeology during difficult time. It was the 20s and 30s, and after the war in the 50s. So you see, our two institutions, in fact, are since the beginning are linked together. So the idea of creating a national museum in France was an idea from the French Revolution. In fact, it was the idea that we had to gather all the remains from the history of the glorious French nation from the beginning of mankind to today. And in fact, it was based on the idea that we had to develop the goals, since at that time the nobility was seen as the descendant of invaders, German ones, to be clear, and when the Gauls were seen as the ancestors of the French. So according to the Gauls, our ancestor was a political claim. It was to say that it was a return of democracy, that the Gauls were the first nation in France. And so, but this project didn't happen, in fact, during the revolution. They had too many things to do. In fact, it was created by the Emperor Napoleon III in 1862. And the opening of the museum was planned in 1867 to coincide with the Exposition Universelle, which was going to take place in Paris. So the idea was, in fact, to open a large national and central museum for France at a time where the entire world would meet in Paris. So the idea, in fact, as you can see, was a national idea. But very soon, people realized that it was impossible to draw any archaeology or history of the French nation just on French material. And it's the same case in Spain. If you want to draw the archaeology of the French past, it's also the archaeology of the Roman past. It's also the archaeology of the Greeks, of the Phoenicians, of the Celts, in fact, of the entire Europe. And so the place to locate this big museum was chosen to be a royal castle. Or it's also a political gesture. You know, it's the monarchy is finished, but the idea was to invest a royal castle in order to put the new wonder. This is the history and the archaeology of France. So the MAN was inaugurated in May 1867 by Napoleon III, so just a few months after the Spanish MAN. And the idea was to bring together all the major remains, which would, it was said the archives, in fact, the material archive of the history of mankind, not just the French, but the history of mankind on the French territory. And what was very original at that time, it was that it was put into comparison with other material, as I said a few minutes earlier, with the material of the archaeology and history of all Europe, but also of the rest of the world. And the idea was to compare, for instance, the prehistoric material found in the Paleolithic caves, for instance, or in the Neolithic dwellings, with those of the so-called primitive society, which were still preserved in the rest of the world. So to compare, for instance, the Neolithic engraving with those found in Papua New Guinea or in Australia, to compare the Paleolithic found in the Pyrenees, the harpoons with that found in Greenland, with people who are still living in such kind of environment, and so on. So the idea, in fact, as you can see, very, very quickly, it went beyond the initial project. It was not just the archaeology of the French in France. It was somehow a total museum. It was a museum of the history and archaeology of mankind. A very original point was the display of the collection. We have always in mind that 19th century museums were full of dust, are a bit old-fashioned, are stuffy. But what was very interesting at that time is that they were experimenting as well archaeology. And the idea was not only to reconstruct the site, but also to for instance, when they were excavating this famous site at Alesia, where the Gallic army were defeated by the Roman and which opened the conquest of Gaul by Caesar, they were experimenting also the Roman and Gallic weaponry to do reproduction. And so it wasn't not just about the display of the remains, but it was also trying to reconstruct the past as it was working and to show it to the public. So somehow a very modern idea. So as I said, it was a museum, and it is still a museum which is completely open onto the world. And the display of the setting of the collection was just finished in the 20s. So as you can see, you know, museums are evolving along, you know, long-term periods. And it was finished by a sociologist who was a close friend to Marcel Mauss. His name is Henri Hubert. And he created a unique room, which was called the Salle de Comparaison, a room for comparative archaeology, in which the archaeology of France was put into comparison with he called that a microcosm, a reduction of the history of mankind in the world. And it was based on the view that this history was the history of techniques. And that techniques were driving the course of the transformation of society and culture all over the world. So something very close to the Peach River Museum in England in the 19th century. So it was not only a place to display collection, but as Andres just said for the Spanish Museum, it was also a place for research, a place where not only scholars from France, but for all over the world would meet and study the collection, but also a place with a lab, a restoration lab, a photographic lab, a lab for producing cast, which was at that time the best way, you know, to compare the collection that you don't have, collection which are in other museums. And so the MAN was a central place for research. It was designed like that. But very soon, towards the middle of the 20th century, the man, Frenchman, meets a crisis. In fact, it was based on an idea which was created in the 19th century, but in the middle of the 20th century, this was a discrepancy between the goals of the museum and how the public who was visiting museum, this discrepancy begin to appear. And the museum was seen quite old-fashioned, saturated with collections, and in fact disconnected with the reorganization of archaeology, which took place in the 40s in France. And so in the 60s, there was a big program which was impulsed by André Malraux. André Malraux was the Minister of Culture with Charles de Gaulle. And the idea was to modernize the museum. And he says, he has a word, he says, there are only two big museums in France, the Louvre and Saint-Germain. And so the idea was to make the display of the collection more simple, you know, more accessible to the general public. And the idea was to make the museum to enter in the 20th century. So this restoration, this transformation of the museum began in the 60s, but it just finished in the course of the 80s. So again, you know, a very long-term evolution. So today, the MAN is still evolving. The display of the collection has been recently renovated. For instance, I've fully renovated the collection I'm in charge of, the Gallic one, and we have acquired a series of major discovery, especially for Gallic and Celtic archaeology. But today, the MAN, and I think it's probably the same situation in Spain. It is at a crossing point, in fact. Contrary to the situation of the 18th century, we don't get necessarily all the collections which are found on the territory. They go to regional and local museums, which is absolutely fair and normal. It was the case like that in the 18th century, since we were the only central museum for archaeology, and since in the 1860s, there were very few museums for archaeology in the rest of France. This is not the situation today, and now we are just acquiring major discoveries. To put it frankly, discoveries which are far too expensive for local and regional museums to buy, or discoveries which cannot go to local museum. So it's good, but it's somehow not so good than that. But what we are going to discover, and I think this is something that we share in common with you, is that we have an extraordinary richness. We are keeping the memory, in fact, of archaeology, not only of French archaeology, but of European archaeology. We have extraordinary archives, and even our collection are a mirror of the history of research in France and elsewhere. And so it's also a place where new advances of research are shown to the general public. So we have also a mission of education, of instruction of the public. So the MAN is still carrying excavation in France and elsewhere. We are regularly involved in major exhibitions, you know, to learn artifacts. And in fact, more and more, we see that we are at the heart of the history of archaeology, which is a recent field of study, which is a growing field of study, you know. And our archives and our collection are bringing new light, new insight on this history of research. So, a few words to conclude. What could be the future? And I think it is also a question what we have in common. So, as you can see, the history of the museum has been following, you know, the course of the history of archaeology, not only in France but also in Europe. So, our history, you know, has been driven by the evolution of research, and by our collection. and our place in the history of the discipline. As I've shown you, we are a national museum, but we are not nationalist at all. You know, we are by definition, although being a French national museum, we are basically fundamentally a European museum, which is also a political task, in fact. We have something to say as archaeologists and as museum about what is Europe, about what Europe should be. We are maybe a bit ahead of the political Europe. You know, we are already a European Republic of scholars, and I think it's provide a different vision of the history of Europe, which is very important, not only for the public, not only for education, but which is also politically important. So I think this is why, in fact, by definition, we need to build a network, in fact. We are not old-fashioned, we are not secondary museum. I think quite at the contrary, we are at the heart of a truly European project in bringing together all these national museums. I thank you for your attention.